thunder with. Lara ran out of the neat little house by the school when at last she heard the sound of the motor. She'd been waiting over 3/4 of an hour now, unable to settle down, her bags packed ready in the hall. She recognized the driver of the battered 4-wheel drive at once. It was her father, she was sure. He jumped out of the car.
"Lara, it is Lara, isn't it?"
She stood silently, leaning on the veranda post, regarding the man she did not know at all, and yet knew so well from the few old photographs her mother had kept. He hesitated a moment.
"It is you, Lara."
She nodded.
"Well, it's me then,"
he said unnecessarily.
"It's your father."
"I know." When he hugged her to him, she couldn't respond, for a storm of tears was inside her, and her mother seemed so close now. He smelled exactly as she'd imagined, of the bush, of fire and wood and sweat, and also faintly of tobacco. She wished she could hug him back, but she drew away when Mrs. Robinson pushed open the wire screen door and greeted him. "Mr. Ritchie," she said warmly.
"Larry Ritchie," he said, awkward now. "Call me Larry, please."
Lara has been more or less ready since the crack of dawn. She moved all her things into the hall about an hour ago. She was expecting you from noon on. She smiled, and then, putting an arm around Lara's thin shoulders, said, "We're glad we finally found you, aren't we, Lara?" Lara found it difficult to know just what to say. Here they were in the hot sun on the veranda of the school principal's house. Her long-lost father. This tall, angular man with his piercing blue eyes, and her beloved teacher. Both of them standing and looking at her and expecting a reply of some kind. But she could only stare dumbly at this total stranger, who was, nevertheless, her only family now. Her father. Mrs. Robinson had spared no effort to find Larry Ritchie, a stranger for more than 11 years to Lara. All the while during her mother's illness, there had been the specter of the home for Lara, if her father could not be traced. Mrs. Robinson had been as firm and as positive as Mom. "We're getting closer all the time to finding him. I'm sure of it. They'll find the man," her mother had told Lara over and over during those last few weeks of her illness. "No child of mine will go to any home. I know Larry will come for you, Lara." And he had. But too late for Cheryl Ritchie, Lara's mother, to know. She died unaware that Mrs. Robinson had tracked Larry and his new family to a remote farm north of Newcastle, just beyond the Bulladella Mountains in the Wallingat Forest. Cheryl Ritchie was never to know that only a few 100 kilometers separated Idle Hours Trailer Park from Larry Ritchie, the man in the crumpled photographs. "Well, let's not stand around here all day. I believe Albert has the kettle on. We'll have a cup of tea before you're on your way." It was Mrs. Robinson who interrupted the prolonged silence. Larry seemed ill at ease inside the house, though both Marjorie and Albert Robinson spoke warmly. "Bit of a job tracking you down, mate," Albert said, handing him a steaming mug of tea, and one for Lara, too. "We heard you'd settled in Queensland." "We did for a while," Larry said. "But Gladwin, that's the wife, well, she couldn't take the heat up there." Lara saw the color surge into his tanned face when he mentioned the word wife, and she glanced away, embarrassed for him and for her mom, who once, long ago, had been the wife. Larry's first wife. You see, we had this offer of a bit of land over the back of the Buladella Mountains on the Forest Road, a couple of 100 acres, so we came there to live for a while and see if we liked it. The wife had her fourth there, young Jasper. He blushed again as he mentioned the unknown family, but then looked straight at Marjorie and said, "And now, thanks to you, we have Lara, too." There was that open, friendly smile again for Lara. She decided then and there that the man, as Mom had always called him, was a really nice man. The minute they'd pulled out of the driveway of the Lakeside School principal's house, Marjorie and Albert Robinson waving furiously, all awkwardness seemed to slip away. Lara found herself talking a great deal as they headed north towards the city of Newcastle and beyond. To the turnoff her dad had told her about at the small town of Buladella that would lead finally to the Forest Road and her new home. The man seemed to like to listen. He asked just the right questions, made just the right responses, so that she found herself recounting the last few months in great detail. She found herself telling him things she didn't think she'd tell anyone. She told him of the night her mother had said they would not have much longer together. She told him of her mother's concern for her daughter, the unsparing efforts she'd made to find Larry before the illness became too dreadful and laid her low, her energy completely sapped. She told him of her mother's cheerfulness and bravery right up until the last, of how, just a few days before she'd died, they'd been laughing together in the hospital at some joke or other. "Just like Cheryl," Larry said quietly. "Mom said that her going would be a new beginning for me. She said it lots of times. But I can't help it. It feels like the end to me," Lara told her father. "She was right, you know, kiddo. This is all new," he said. "You'll have a brand new family, Lara. A baby brother and 3 little sisters and a new mom. I'm not pretending it'll be easy, but it's a fresh start, and if we all try hard, it's bound to work out okay." She liked the way he spoke so quietly and cheerfully. Perhaps Mom was right. It would be a new beginning with a man. If only Mom had been here to share it. She stared out the window at the scenery that was unfamiliar to her now that they'd left the sprawling outskirts of Newcastle behind them. It was really the country here, she thought. Those rolling fields and glimpses of occasional farmhouses, and all the stationary cows that looked like cardboard cutouts, they were so still. Lara liked the sound of the man's farm in the forest, too. Living on a farm would be good. Perhaps there'd be horses, and she could learn to ride with the kids who were her new family. There were magnificent beaches nearby, the man told her. They'd all go surfing together. Yes, perhaps it'd be okay in the end. Lara felt sleepy. The sun was riding high, and the motion of the car and all her talking made her tired. She closed her eyes. The man didn't seem to mind that Lara didn't want to talk anymore. She wondered now, as she'd wondered before, why her mom and the man hadn't stayed together. He seemed so comfortable, so strong, so nice. Lara could only vaguely remember the man. Mom had left him when Lara had only been 3, and she'd met the musician from Melbourne, Walter. She distinctly remembered Walter, for all his unkindnesses to her as a small child. Mom had stuck it out in Melbourne with Walter for almost 3 years, but finally, when their fights became too bad, she'd left him and taken Lara back to live near Sydney. They went to Mom's only friend, Narelle, who lived at St. Mary's, not far from the Blue Mountains. You could actually see the mountains from Narelle's back doorstep, a wavy line on the horizon. They changed with the weather from smoky blue to gray-green. But she and Mom had never been up there the whole time they stayed at St. Mary's. Mom always said they'd go. "We'll see the three sisters, Lara, and have a picnic in Megalong Valley one weekend soon." But somehow Mom was always too tired. She'd recite her bush poems to Lara often enough, though, when they sat on Narelle's back step, leaving Lara to dream of the magic places that might be up there. By channels of coolness the echoes are calling, and down the dim gorges I hear the creek falling. It lives in the mountain, where moss and the sedges touch with their beauty the banks and the ledges. Through breaks of the cedar and sycamore bowers struggles the light that is love to the flowers. And softer than slumber, and sweeter than singing, the notes of the bellbirds are running and ringing. They lived with Narelle and her 2 small kids for quite a while. But one day Mom said she'd had enough of St. Mary's. She decided to move closer into the city. Mom said work would be easier to find. There'd been the series of apartments and rooms in broken-down houses for them then, each one worse than the last. Mom tried to stay cheerful, but one day in the middle of winter when the hot water broke down, Mom yelled at the stubborn heater, "Enough! You've done it this time! I've had enough of you, you stinking rotten thing!" That night, after a cold water wash for both of them in their freezing room, Mom decided that they should head north to the lakes area. Just like that. It was the way Mom did things. She'd been told that living was cheaper up north, a few 100 kilometers from Sydney, and warmer too. So that's where they'd go. "We're going to live in a trailer," she announced to Lara, as if it were the most exciting prospect in the world. Like going to live in a wonderful mansion or castle or something. "We'll be by a lake and you can go swimming, and maybe we can even have a little boat, Lara. It'll be wonderful. You'd better believe it." Yes, they would live in a trailer beside Lake Munmora, and Mom would find a job and save up, and then eventually they'd buy a house. "It'll be like being on vacation all the time," Mom said enthusiastically. Mom usually managed to see the bright side of things. "So you won't feel one bit sorry about leaving the city, will you, Lara?" Lara wasn't sorry to be leaving the city and her school where she had been at the bottom of her class, and people had constantly talked about her learning problems. They'd lived in a trailer at Idle Hours Trailer Park for 2 years. Mom had worried at first about it not being a proper house, but it had turned out to be the happiest time in their life, Lara reflected. Things seemed to go so well for them once they came to live in the large trailer that even had its own front garden. "How pretty! A garden right by our door, Lara," Mom had said the first day, noticing a wild clump of nasturtiums, the only thing in bloom in the dusty, ragged garden. "And my favorite flowers in all the world, Lara. Well, after roses, that is." She'd picked a nasturtium and worn it in her crinkly red hair. Mom had got a job right away at the local garage doing typing and bookkeeping. Mom had planted a rose tree, and it had bloomed twice right by the front door among the nasturtiums. And Lara had learned to read properly at last. A miracle had happened with the help of her teacher, Mrs. Robinson. It had been hell being so old, knowing you could hardly read at all, and thinking you'd never, ever learn. Lara was sure she was stupid because she just couldn't seem to get it together. So many people had tried to help her in the past, but no one had tried quite like Mrs. Robinson. "But I don't want to read kids' books," Mom had complained. She was staggering to the car with a dozen or more books piled in her arms. Mrs. Robinson and Lara followed with more books in their hands. "Tell me that after you've tried these," Mrs. Robinson insisted. "I'll help Lara here at school, and you help her at home, okay?" She was so bossy about it that Mom had dutifully pored over the titles and said, "I suppose this one looks okay, love. Do you mind if I read it to you, Lara? She's said to read every day." Lara hadn't minded at all. They usually read in the long summer twilights after the dishes were done. They'd lie on Mom's double bed, leaving the trailer door open so that they could glimpse trees and the lake, and Mom would read to her for hours on end. And a world beyond Idle Hours Trailer Park and Lakeside Public School that neither of them had ever dreamed of opened up to them. They traveled through forests and mountains, in cities of the past and future, to civilizations beyond Earth. They'd found places with the weirdest of names. Listen to this one, Lara. Lothlorien. I can hardly pronounce it, but it's so beautiful, this place. I think we should visit, don't you, after tea? And they'd wandered through them together. Lara even dreamed about them sometimes. And as heroes sought rings or maps or treasures, and dealt with triumphs or sudden mishaps, Lara and her mom had laughed and cried together. And they'd talked about the stories when they finished reading. Talked and talked, the way they used to talk about the TV shows they no longer had time to watch. "I guess that stranger who came into the village is going to be bad news for Will, don't you, Mom?" Lara asked as she spread peanut butter thickly on her toast. Mom agreed, jabbing her fried egg thoughtfully with a fork. "He's a real bad egg, Lara." They were sometimes still talking about stories when Mom dropped Lara at school. And afternoons, Mom would spend ages in the library, looking for the next book in the series and the next. Mrs. Robinson didn't say, "I told you so," but she looked kind of pleased when Mom would say, "Can we borrow this stack for the weekend?" And then the miracle of Lara's reading had taken place, almost overnight. After years of struggling and fear and despair and tears, the jumbled mass of sticks and circles on the page that so often held no meaning for her kaleidoscoped together, and suddenly it said something in her head. Lara could recall the exact day this happened. It was a Friday. The day her mom and Mrs. Robinson drove to Newcastle, where they were both doing a computer course. Lara had a new book from the library, but she simply couldn't wait for Mom to come home. She had flung herself on Mom's bed with a book in her hands. It wasn't until about page 20 that Lara realized what was happening. She'd never really read more than a few pages at a time, and only when she had to, with an adult beside encouraging her as she stumbled over the words. And now she'd plunged headlong into the story. 20 pages had flown by, and she hadn't even realized. Sure, she'd skipped plenty of big words, but the story made sense, and she was reading by herself. "Hey, she cried out across the trailer to no one and to everyone. Hey, I can read! I'm reading! When Mom came in, rather tired as she always was after evening classes, there was no tea ready. Lara was waiting for her, book in hand. Guess what, Mom? She'd shouted. Guess what? Then when she told her the news, Mom had dropped her folder to the floor in surprise. She'd grabbed Lara, and they'd done an excited, awkward, wonderful dance around the tiny trailer. Both of them were shrieking and laughing and crying a bit too. I knew you could do it, Lara. Mom hugged her yet again. I knew it. Mrs. Robinson was right. She knows exactly what she's doing. We'll cook a special celebration cake for her in the morning. Then Mom had stuck her head out of the trailer door and yelled at the top of her voice, Lara's a very smart kid! My smart kid! Bonnie Sudovich, Mom's friend who lived a few trailers down, had yelled back, I know! And then came down to find out exactly why Lara was so smart this time. Bonnie had hugged Lara, but it was really Mrs. Robinson Lara was longing to see. Saturday morning, they'd disturbed Albert in the vegetable garden at the back of the school principal's house. He'd rushed inside to call Mrs. Robinson, who was out visiting. Come home, he'd said, as if it were the most urgent thing in the world. Lara Ritchie's here to tell you something very important. Mom said Lara's learning to read was a turning point in their lives. I thought I'd hate living in this trailer park, you know, Lara? I hated leaving Melbourne. I hated leaving Sydney. But we've had the best time here. In next to no time, you've learned to read properly. And now Mrs. Robinson is helping me get a better job. In about another year, we'll look for that house outside Newcastle, and you can go to high school there. It's going to be all right. Amazing how things can change so quickly. Lara was glad to see her mother so happy, so enthused. Something good always turns up, Lara, she'd told her daughter. You'd better believe it. And then the illness had turned up, and for a few awful weeks Mom was in turmoil. It had come silently, voraciously, almost painlessly. Mom had had backaches for 3 or 4 days. When the x-rays came back, the doctors suggested tests. When the test results came back, they mentioned the awful word she dreaded, and yet insisted on hearing. They told her cancer. They told Mom everything, because she demanded everything. The x-rays, the reports, the whole story. Mom had read her medical reports as eagerly as she'd read the children's books, and explained what she could to Lara. Now listen to me, Lara. I'm not going to give up easily. There's a chance. Not much of one, but I'm going for it. I'm trying everything, and I mean everything. It was so like Mom to be enthusiastic. But just in case the old liver decides to pack it in, we're going to make special plans for you. They'd talked a lot in the following months about Lara's father, Larry Ritchie, or the man, as she called him. Just in case, Lara, I want you to know all about him. Lara listened, but she wasn't really interested. She didn't really want to know about the man. She just wanted Mom to get well again. And Lara was sure her mother would get well. She kept going to work and she stayed positive and cheerful. It was just after every treatment at the hospital she was very, very tired. Sometimes even too tired to talk. That was when Lara had read to her, sometimes for hours on end, so pleased to be able to do it. Yes, Mom would pull through, she was sure. They needed each other. Mom wouldn't go and leave her. But one afternoon when she came home from school, Mom had bad news for her daughter. "I'm sorry, love. I can't seem to go on anymore," Mom apologized. "I'll only be in the hospital for a few weeks, just to get me over this bit. You're to stay with Albert and Marjorie Robinson for a while. They'll bring you to see me every day. I'll be home in a week or two." But Mom had never come home again. In the hospital ward, cheerful with chintz, Lara spent hours talking or reading to her. Sometimes she'd read out some of Mom's favorite poems, the ones about the Australian bush. But the familiar lines about bellbirds or the man from Snowy River made Lara feel all choked up. It made her think of Mom reciting them in her dramatic stage voice out the trailer door and across the lake, and already this seemed a memory of the past. Lara preferred to read some of their favorite parts out of the many books they had shared. "In a few weeks, or maybe months, Lara, we're going to have to say goodbye," Mom finally conceded one day. "You might think it'll be forever, love. It won't be forever. I can assure you we'll be meeting again. Let's make a meeting place, Lara, right now. How about the secret garden with all the rose trees? Or Tom's midnight garden? Remember that place, Lara? Oh, it was so lovely." "That's only books, Mom," Lara had burst out. "It's fantasy." "It isn't fantasy that we've been to those places together now, is it?" That was the only time that Lara had cried. She'd put her head down on the bright floral hospital cover and wept bitterly. "Don't be like that," Mom had comforted her. "You mustn't be afraid. Look at me, Lara." And she'd taken her hand. "You remember the dark bird I told you about, that used to come fluttering into my life every so often, made me feel so miserable and down. And remember how I'd make it fly off and leave me alone? Well, there's a dark bird hovering over you right now. But you'll send it on its way, I know it. Not now, Lara, but later on. I know it. Try not to be afraid, Lara. You've got to look your fear full in the face, love, and then things won't seem so bad." Mom had said this kind of thing many times in the past. It had often helped her. But with so much to fear, now and up ahead, Mom's words didn't seem to help at all. Now about this cancer thing, I must admit there have been times when I've been angry, good and angry, and times when I've been scared too, Lara. Mostly lying here in the hospital thinking about it, I've been puzzled. I couldn't work out why it should be that I won't see you grow up to be the lovely young woman I know you'll be. And then, Lara, I thought about the man. I've wanted so much for you to know the man, Larry, your dad. And after I left him for that Walter in our time in Melbourne, well, I've never been able to find him. We'll find him now, I'm sure of it. Mrs. Robinson has people in the police department working on it right now. You won't just meet the man, you'll be living with him again. You'll get to love him, be his daughter. He's a beautiful person, Lara. But they hadn't found Larry Ritchie easily. And when Narelle said she couldn't possibly cope with another child in her house at St. Mary's, the home loomed dangerously close for Lara. Lying alone in the unfamiliar space of a large bedroom in Mrs. Robinson's house, Lara thought about the home a lot. She'd read about orphanages in books. They always seemed cruel, awful places where children picked on each other and adults were generally unsympathetic. Mrs. Robinson assured her that this wasn't so anymore, that you'd have a house mother and house father. You'd live like a great big family in a pleasant home and go to a regular school. She said if she and Albert hadn't been going away overseas to her daughters, Lara could have stayed with them a while. She promised Lara that when they came back, she could come to them for school vacations. Don't think about that home too much, Lara. They're still searching for your dad, and I've got the feeling they'll find him. Lara hoped against hope that her mom would see the man and know that Lara was safe. But she'd been gone almost 2 weeks when news came through to the Robinsons that a Larry Ritchie family were living on a remote farm in the Wallingat Forest area. There was no phone, but the local post office had given a message to his wife. Ritchie was away working up north, it seemed. She wasn't sure where he was or when he'd be back. 3 days later, on a long-distance call, Larry Ritchie had announced himself to his daughter. Of course you won't be going to any home in Sydney, Lara. The only home you'll be going to is ours. Now just hold on there, kiddo, and I'll be down in about a week to get you. She liked the man's quiet voice at once. She'd liked the way he'd called her kiddo, as if he'd known her for ages. She longed to see him and to tell him all about Mom. She knew at once that she wanted to go home with him, wherever home might be.